John K. Tillinghast. Thank you for joining us in Sealaska Heritage Institute's lecture series. Sealaska Heritage Institute is a Native nonprofit dedicated to perpetuating and enhancing Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian cultures of Southeast Alaska. As a nonprofit organization, Sealaska Heritage can do our work throughout Sealaska without donations. If you would like to donate to Sealaska Heritage, please visit sealaskaheritage.org/giving. Today, we welcome Georgetown University Law Center graduate John K. Tillinghast. He served for more than 30 years as a general counsel to the Tlingit Haida Regional Housing Authority and authored numerous briefs on Native subsistence and historic site issues before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the U.S. District Court for Alaska, and U.S. Department of the Interior. He also represented the village of Hoonah in its successful effort to establish a borough encompassing traditional Tlingit territory. Tillinghast will recount the decades-long effort to secure Redoubt Bay, Kunah, a Tlingit summer village and sockeye salmon harvesting place located near Sitka, as a historical site under Alaskan Native stewardship. The 10.54-acre parcel was officially conveyed to Sealaska Corporation earlier this year, nearly 50 years after the corporation first filed the land under Section 14H1 of the Alaska Native Claims Settlements Act, ANCSA. The legal process to secure the site involved numerous regulatory and political hurdles, competing claims, and persistent advocacy. Tillinghast, who has represented Sealaska on land and natural resource issues for over 4 decades, will share key legal strategies and historical context surrounding the effort. At this time, I'd like for everyone to silence their phones. There will be time at the end of the lecture to ask questions. Now, without further ado, please help me welcome John Tillinghast.
So, for those of you who were at my talk in February, the PowerPoint then had nothing but pretty drab-looking text. This one, as you can see, has kind of the cover page of a very alluring travel brochure. And there's more of these to come, so things are perking up. Let's use this slide to kind of get our bearings. What you're looking at is Redoubt Bay. The bay's out here. Snaking in the background is Redoubt Lake. And in the middle, this little white part. This is the falls where Redoubt Lake empties into Redoubt Bay. We're about 16 miles south of Sitka here, and this area was the site of a well before European time Tlingit village that was on the north shore of these falls. And the village was called Kunah. And these are the falls. And this is where most of our talk is going to be centered, because this is where most of the human activity was. And as I said, this is where the Kunah village was located. And it's also, they were here because right here at the falls is where a whole lot of sockeye salmon get backed up on their way to their spawning grounds inside the lake. And the amount of sockeye that get into the lake is pretty astounding. There's a couple of testimonials here. There's one from 1825 from a Russian observer that this lake was at the heart of the Sitka Tlingit's survival because, as they said, it supplies all of those that live there. Kind of 180 years later, you've got the Forest Service noting that the falls are heavily used by Sitka residents as a whole to fish for sockeye, mainly by dip netting. And then finally, an amazing statistic. These are the 2024 escapement numbers for Kunah, and the escapement of sockeye in Kunah Lake was 223,000 sockeye. That's a whole lot of sockeye to get backed up against those falls, so you can get kind of a flavor for how rich that particular geography is. What we're going to do today is we're going to cover three basic topics. One is the history and, above all, the resilience of the village of Kuna. We're going to talk a little bit about more than a little, about the cultural importance of the village to the Tlingit. And finally, a 50-year battle that Sealaska undertook to protect that village site under ANCSA in the spite of early and very persistent opposition from both the U.S. Forest Service and the Sitka Conservation Society, and a competing application for the same land from our good friends at Sheldon Jackson College. Here, we've got a layout of the old village site. And you can see, whoops, get back here, John. These are the falls, which you just saw. The north shore of the village, north shore of the falls, where most of the village was located. There was some activity down here, but most of the village activity was here on the north shore. Now, so our first step is to document the existence of this village before Europeans came. The challenge that we face is that there's no physical evidence of this village for a couple of reasons. One, the village used, the Tlingits used organic building materials, and those rot as time goes by. And the other, there was, as we'll see, periodic European usage of these same areas that pretty well trampled on a lot of what might have been left. So we're left with history. And like most American Indian tribes, Tlingits had no written history, and they had to rely entirely on oral history. So oral history, that's just, those tall tales. But preserving one's history accurately is important to every society. And when all you've got is oral history, that puts a premium on making sure that oral history is carried forward from generation to generation just as accurately as possible. And as a result, the Tlingit, like a lot of different native societies, have built in a lot of safeguards to make sure that long ago history is accurately translated for their descendants. And as a result, oral history is used extensively by anthropologists to piece together native history. And that's why I've got these two quotes, one from Dr. Stephen Langdon, who put together an affidavit in connection with the case I was handling with his help, that talks about the safeguards that the tribes put in place to make sure their oral history is accurate. And then second, a quote from Goldsmith and Haas, that in fact oral history is actually a principal mechanism that anthropologists use to trace native history. And just a word about the book that they put out, Ha'ani, Our Land. Goldsmith, by the way, was an anthropology professor at UCLA for about 30 years. Thomas Haas was the general counsel of what was the predecessor of the BIA. So these guys kind of knew what they were talking about. The book Ha'ani was published relatively recently, but it's based on very extensive interviews that were done throughout Southeast Alaska in 1946 to try and put together a very accurate and detailed history of who owned what in Southeast Alaska among the native tribes. So here's kind of the library we had to work with to try and piece the history together. We had several anthropological treatises that mentioned the existence of this village. And again, I'm talking now about pre-European history. There were widespread references in Russian literature to this village, and we're going to get to some of those. There were extensive interviews in Ha'ani, which is the book that we just talked about. Then, when Sealaska applied to obtain protection of this area under ANCSA, there was a lot of interview work done both by Sealaska consultants, by BIA, by the Forest Service, and by the University of Alaska. And then finally, in 1981, Sealaska Heritage's own Chuck Smythe did quite a comprehensive work the history of this area that had a lot of interviews in it. So there was a pretty good sized library to work from, and from that you can kind of draw this thumbnail, and this is again pre-European. The history tells us that on the North Shore there's a village of about 40 or 50 people. They had about 10 cedar and shake roofed smokehouses with adjoining sleeping quarters. It was the biggest camp among the clan that owned it. We'll get to that in a second. And it was not just seasonal. Of course, it was there to catch sockeye in the summer, but it was used to gather berries and to hunt deer in the fall, and then to trap in the winter. And interestingly, it was so important to the Kiksadi clan, which is the clan that owned it, that they built two forts, one on either side of the mouth, well, either side of the falls, to protect it from invasion. The literature and the oral history recitations are unanimous that the village was owned by the Kiksadi clan, which is a Sitka clan. And the references all speak for themselves, except for one. It's a quote that's going to get pretty relevant here in a minute about how the Russians handled the fact that this was a Kiksadi-owned piece of property. And that's that the Russians paid rent to the Kiksadi clan leader. They gave the clan leader food and clothing. They, according to this narrative, dressed him up like a Russian prince and gave him Russian Cossacks at his disposal. So he was treated pretty much like royalty, and that was the price the Russians paid for building a fort at Redoubt, which is what we're going to talk about next. Because now we're going to switch to the Russian period, which began in the very late 1700s, early 1800s. We know that there was the village activity in that period of time, to begin with, by the initial name that the Russians gave to Redoubt Bay, or Redoubt Lake. It was Tyon's Bay. And Tyon and Yakut, which is a Siberian Yupik language, in Yakut, Tyon means chief. And that's how Russians saw that bay. And as we just saw, the Russians were paying rent to the Kiksadi chief to build their fort there. In addition to that, at least starting in 1820, Russian policy, as passed on to the Russian-American Company, was to not dispossess natives from their territorial holdings. That if they wanted to occupy an area that was native-owned, they had to get the permission of the native occupants. Between 1812 and 1818, the Russians built a fort at Redoubt, and originally it was set up as to catch sockeye, as you might imagine, and salt them. But as time went on, the Russians built a sawmill and a flour mill there, and it became a pretty substantial facility. And that Bob DeArmond, who's a pretty well-known Alaska historian, kind of described what the fort looked like at its peak. And it had a stockade, it had a blockhouse, it had 8 cannons, 2 barracks, workmen's houses, a manager's house, the fishery building, of course, and then the 2 mills, one for timber, one for flour. And I found this lithograph of the old fort, and it's the only one that I could find anywhere. And the artist, I think, kind of took a little romantic liberty with it. You can see the falls are here, but you just saw the falls don't look like that. These cataracts are a lot different than the ones that actually existed. But they're there. They're describing the cataracts. What's even more interesting is this over here sure looks like a church. Now, there's nothing in the written literature that suggests that this fort, which is here, ever had a church. So I'm guessing whoever drew this threw it at church to make the whole thing look more bucolic, to maybe make it look more attractive to Russian workers who they wanted to come out and work at this place. But be that it may, that's the best illustration we've got of what that fort looked like. Even though they were paying rent to the Kiksadi chief, there was still a lot of trouble between the Tlingits, Kiksadi in particular, and the Russian fort. The 1820s, the Kiksadi made a number of unsuccessful attacks on the fort. And an incident occurred in 1825, which we can spend a minute with because it's interesting for a number of reasons. According to a Russian chronicler who reported this to the Russian American company, this occurred in the winter. About 300 Tlingits showed up at the falls to fish for herring. There were 38 Russians in the fort. They got scared. They panicked and they opened fire on the Tlingit and killing one. And the chronicler said, well, the Russians opened fire because they were scared by the number of the Tlingits and they thought their fort was going to be under attack. And he's described the Tlingit presence as being a nomadic village of about 300 people. The lessons from that incident are kind of like twofold. First, the Russian chronicler said, well, the Tlingits did this on purpose. They got real near the fort on purpose to see if our guns were in order, to see if they worked, so they could plan a future attack. And that was because, and this was a quote we saw earlier, that area, those falls, were at the heart of Kiksadi's existence because they fed the entire clan. So the report is kind of noteworthy in two respects. One, we know that the Tlingit presence at Kuna remained substantial during this period of time, with 300 people, and it remained of existential importance to the Kiksadi, or the chronicler's word, it lies at their heart. In the 1850s and the 1860s, the Russians said "Das Svidaniya." Over the last 40 years of Russian occupation, Ozerkai Resort, which is what Ozerkai Redoubt, its population declined from 38 at its peak down to 9 people in 1861 because the flour mill had been flooded and was never put back together again. The sawmill was dilapidated, and actually what happened was the sawmill ran out of timber in the area around Redoubt Bay to fuel the mill, and so it closed. And then finally in 1867, Russia, of course, ceded Alaska to the United States, and leading Gibson, who is one of the anthropologists who has written most about this particular area, and again was the source of that lithograph I showed you earlier. Russian America ceased to exist, but Lake Redoubt and the Tlingit remained, and the salmon continued to run. Then 4 years later, in 1871, the Kiksadi just burned what was left of Ozerkai Redoubt to the ground, and that was the end of Ozerkai Redoubt. So now we get into the American period. Between 1867 and 1910, there were 2 instances where different American interests temporarily built things at Redoubt Bay, at the village site, but neither lasted, neither was permanent, and neither instance of that occupation was exclusive. In 1889, the Baranoff Packing Company opened a saltery there. It lasted 2 years until they had basically devastated the fishery. So what they did, they packed up the entire saltery and moved it to a different place in Southeast Alaska. The only other instance of Europeans doing anything at Redoubt was that a fellow by the name of John Brady built a cabin there in 1891, but he abandoned it in 1910, and it quickly fell into disrepair and fell apart. And that was it. That was the sum total of American activity there at Kuna. And particularly if you go to Ha'ani, remember Ha'ani was a book that was based on interviews in 1946. You get a lot of quotes from people looking back just a few decades that chronicle consistent, significant activity by the Kiksadi in this area through the middle of the of the 20th century. One thing you do notice is that the presence of smokehouses tends to diminish as the 20th century goes by. And that was because both the U.S. and territorial laws discouraged the placement of smokehouses near significant fisheries. So that's a history of the village itself. Now let's take a look at kind of the cultural importance of the village to Tlingit culture and Kiksadi culture in particular. First is legends. Now, legends are normally reserved for important places. You're not going to waste a good legend on something that doesn't matter. Kuna has two legends. The first involves a fellow who, for some reason, could not catch fish at the falls. God knows why, but he couldn't. So he gave up and started walking up the banks of Mount that mountain, to leave the village. The guy apparently had not read or didn't, or just paid no attention to the story of Lot's wife, who was told not to look back at Sodom as she was leaving, but she did anyway, and she got turned into a pillar of salt. Well, halfway up the mountain, our fellow looked back at the village. He didn't turn into a pillar of salt, but he did turn into a big stone that apparently is still there and looks like a human being. And I'll tell you, I was at Kuna with a couple of tribal members last week, looking up at Mount, I'm going to get this right, Dranishnikov, to find the rock. We could not find it. People swear it's there. I'm sure there's somebody in Sitka who could, if they were here, probably not. Raise their hands, I was right over there. But it's there somewhere. But the important thing is that this guy who turned into stones was named Kuna. And that's who they named the village after. It's named Kuna because of this poor guy who decided that he was going to look back at the village halfway up the mountain on his way out. The second is that there was a canoe of Tlingit folks. They were canoeing up the lake to get to the other end of the lake, presumably to the Sakai stream that's at the far end of the lake. And this giant crab came out of the water, its claw pulled at the boat, capsized it. The legend doesn't really say what happened to the Tlingits in the canoe. It does add that apparently the crab is still there, but it's now harmless. The one note that I would make about that is that, sometimes legends have a base in reality, and Redoubt Lake is a meromictic lake, which means that it has a saltwater layer in its lower half, freshwater layer on its top half, and the two don't mix. And of course, down at the bottom is saltwater. Saltwater is where crabs live. So maybe this was some way of memorializing the fact that, and passing on to anybody who cared to listen, that in fact this lake has a saltwater bottom. I don't know, I'm guessing, but the legend is there, and there you go. The next is not at all, this is not at all limited to Redoubt Lake. And this is Hashagun, which is really loosely summarized, and probably you guys all know this, as the present day relationship between you and your ancestors. And rather than try to gum things up with a more complex and probably not particularly accurate elaboration of that, I'm just going to quote from something George Bennett said about his return visit to Redoubt, and I'll just quote part of it. But this is George talking. But also, my whole intent was to return to a place of my grandfather's people. It always seems to hold a place in our heart, to have the calling to stand on the land where my grandfather Thomas Bennett utilized. The Tlingit, we have a way of saying when we speak, "Please forgive us, my grandfather's people." actually speaking to the spirit of my grandfather, who I know is still there. This is proper. This is proper respect for the spirits of the people when we say that. Your grandchildren are here. We are very respectful of how we walk around on this land. We have come to acquire some food. My grandfather, Kunashish. That is definitely a cultural link between that particular, well, it's not there anymore, between Redoubt Lake and the Kiksati people and Tlingit as a whole. Lastly is, as a matter of, I assume, considerable cultural pride, the role that the Tlingit played and that their obstreperousness at Redoubt in particular played in kicking out the Russians. And there's a couple of quotes here, and these are not quotes from Tlingits congratulating themselves over kicking out the Russians. These are quotes from frustrated Russians who realized that the Tlingits had beat them and it was time to leave. And these first two quotes are from I think the same Russian governor. In 1823, he was quite blunt about it. Said the Kalashes, and by the way, Kalash was a Russian name. Originally, it meant kind of all the Northwest Coast Indians. It was eventually narrowed to just mean Tlingit and Haida. The Kalash never missed an opportunity to kill Russians, whom they considered their enemies and oppressors and who came to rule their land and steal their property. 3 years later, he was a bit philosophical, and what he basically said was, if you add up all of the losses that the Russians have suffered by plundering the Tlingit, and you compare them to all of the gains that they've achieved by that plundering, the gains don't equal even 1/4 of the magnitude of the losses. And that's what he's saying there. And last, a very well-respected Russian historian, Alexander Grinev, and by the way, it's Grinev, not Grinax, I apologize for that, acknowledged that, and I'm just going to read this, particularly for those that are online and may not be able to see it all that well. The research permits one to conclude that it was the Tlingit Indians who played the most important role in Russian America's fate. Their resistance inhibited Russia's southwards advance along the northwest coast, and their actions from 1802 to 1810, which of course encompasses the two battles of Sitka, significantly weakened the Russian-American company's position in Alaska. Neither the few Russians in the Alaska colonies nor the Russian-American company itself was in a position to subdue the numerous, well-armed and experienced Tlingit fighters. That's a general observation about Tlingit pushback on Russia throughout Southeast Alaska, but we know there was pushback at Ozarkai, and that had to contribute to it. Remember that there were those early attacks in the 1980s. There was the panic that resulted from the 1825 confrontation, and even afterwards, the Kiksati were located pretty much right next to the fort there, using that same geography for their purposes, and that had to cause a lot of discomfort among the Russians who were forced to live and work there. So let's kind of just take a big picture look here. We know the Kiksati maintained a near year-round village at Redoubt from essentially time immemorial. The Tlingit occupation of the village, and indeed the Redoubt ecosystem as a whole, survived both Russian occupation and subsequent attempts by non-natives to exploit the area, like the Baranof Packing Company. And finally, that Kuna and its resources have always played a critical role in both the economy and the culture of the Kiksati clan and the Tlingit. So let's turn now to what was done to try and protect that area, that historic area, for future generations. And ANCSA gave us that opportunity. Section 14H1 of ANCSA, in addition to a corporation's general land entitlement, gave regional corporations the ability to acquire historic sites outside of their general selection area. There were deed restrictions on using the land to bar any use that was incompatible with its historic values. And in December of 1975, Sealaska applied for 10.5 acres of land, the village site, under 14H1. What that did was set in motion a 50-year, complex, expensive, and highly contentious process that we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about. When the application was submitted, the BLM, who receives the application, has to obtain views from a number of interested agencies. One is BIA, and the BIA concurred that Kuna is a significant place that possesses enduring symbolic value and was the site of important events impacting the Kiksati. And the National Park Service reached the same conclusion. Ozakai Results site provides a link to their past, there being the Kiksati, and has enduring symbolic value to traditions, beliefs, and practices. They clearly thought that the property was eligible. On the other hand, the U.S. Forest Service was very persistent in maintaining that this was not a native site and should not qualify as an historic site. I've given you two quotes here. One from 1981, that there was saying that there was no evidence discovered that the site was ever occupied as a native village, and then decades later, in 2005, that this site was a Russian site. It wasn't the native site. I think what happened here is that the Forest Service was fixated on the lack of physical evidence of a native site and gave no weight whatsoever to all of the oral history that we were talking about earlier in this talk. The other is that the Forest Service simply didn't want to get rid of this valuable piece of Tongass National Forest property. It was the Forest Service has always maintained, and still to this day maintains, the weir there to count the sockeye and to help manage the sockeye along with fish and game. And I think at one point in time there was a Forest Service recreational cabin at Redoubt. So they didn't want it out of their portfolio, and they were quite dogged in that. And Redoubt, of course, involved a lot of different interests, as you can imagine, given how we described it earlier, the site earlier. The most interested, of course, was the Sitka tribe. Now, under 14H1, the regional corporation has to be the one applying for the conveyance. Village corporations and tribes cannot. But Sealaska recognized that the Sitka tribe was kind of the real party in interest here. And as early as back in 2012, Sealaska and the Sitka tribe entered into an MOU that provided for the joint management of Redoubt. The Sitka Conservation Society was absolutely rabid in their opposition to Sealaska getting the land. And I'm putting in one particularly emotional quote here, one that the Sitka Conservation Society published statewide, which says, "This is an absolute tragedy that this is happening. It's an absolutely unethical that this land should be transferred from public hands to a private corporation." So between the persistent Forest Service opposition and the Sitka Conservation Society opposition, and on top of that, the fact that BLM, frankly, was overloaded during this period of time with land selection applications from both native corporations and the state of Alaska under the Statehood Act, the application, 37 years after filing, which takes us to 2012, there had been virtually no progress on Sealaska's application. So what Sealaska did to try and move things along, and this is something that I represented Sealaska on, was to initiate settlement negotiations with the city and borough of Sitka, the Forest Service, and the Sitka tribe to see if we could come to some agreement on how this property would be managed if Sealaska's application were approved. And in March of 2012, we were focusing on a working draft, a final working draft, that would have guaranteed public access to the falls fishery so they could The public could keep dip netting for sockeye there. Guaranteed Forest Service continued access to the weir, and would trade Sealaska's support to the Forest Service for the Forest Service easements with Forest Service support for our application. And we really did seem very close to settling this thing until, and there's in all caps and all board, until, so drum roll please, until in that same month, Sheldon Jackson added 13 more years to the application process by filing an application for 160 acres of Redoubt Lake, including the entirety of our village site, under the Federal Color of Title Act. Now, the Federal Color of Title Act has got a number of elements, but the three that deserve mention: there has to be a good faith belief that whoever makes the claim has a good faith belief that they own the land, even though they don't because there's some defect in the title. They have had held that non-title for at least 20 years, and they would have had to have constructed valuable improvements on the property that still exist at the time of application. And as I said, that's Sheldon Jackson application was for 160 acres that basically covered much of the southern end of Redoubt Lake. That set in motion a long and in many ways ironic process. First of all, Sheldon Jackson's claim was rooted in obscure documentation from the Russian period. So that resulted in a long and tedious record retrieval effort to dig out old Russian records. And second, ended up resulting in proceedings before the Bureau of Land Management, the Interior Board of Land Appeals, which is the IBLA, and for a time, the U.S. District Court. And Sheldon Jackson College kind of seemed an unusual claimant. Now, first of all, it's kind of ironic that a former Indian boarding school was claiming a right to the property that's superior to a tribe's traditional ownership of the same property. At the time Sheldon Jackson submitted his application, Sheldon Jackson was closed. The college was closed. And they were being sued by a major creditor and were on the verge of insolvency. And in 2016, which was the year before the IBLA issued its final decision, Sheldon Jackson itself just dissolved. So let's talk about the basis for Sheldon Jackson's claim. And it's all rooted in what happened around the time of the Treaty of Cession. When Alaska passed from the Russians to the Americans, the Russians and the Americans had to take stock of what property had been conveyed by the Russian-American company, and therefore would not pass to America at the time of cession. And so two documents emerged. The first was a declaration from a Russian prince that said, well, these two American entrepreneurs from San Francisco, guys by the name of Moss and Baum, had been given or paid for, whatever, had been conveyed the structures and improvements at Ozarkai Redoubt. But it didn't say anything about the land, just the buildings. Then the Russian and American commissioners got together and they prepared two lists. The first list was a list of all the real property that had been conveyed before the Treaty of Cession. And just a note here, the Russian-American company had no authority to convey real property to anybody except employees of the Russian-American company, which Moss and Baum, by the way, were not. But anyway, Moss and Baum and Redoubt Bay were not on the real property list. There was a second list that listed personal property that had been conveyed. Moss and Baum and the Redoubt fixtures were on that, but that list ended with a caveat that said, this list is approved, but it is not intended to recognize by this approval any interest in the land on which improvements exist. So it's very clear from the Russian documents that Moss and Baum, they got the logs, they got the buildings, they got the sinks, but they did not get the land. They had no interest in real property. However, being good 19th century American entrepreneurs, Moss and Baum then proceeded to sell that which they did not own. They sold in fee simple that 160 acres, the land itself, to a couple of fellow entrepreneurs named Lyndon Bow. Lyndon Bow then, over time, passed it on to the Baranoff Packing Company. Baranoff Packing Company conveyed it in fee simple to John Brady. That was inherited by Brady's heirs, and finally was passed on to Sheldon Jackson College in 1981. Now, this is important. The IBLA, the ultimate decision maker in this case, ruled that all of these grantees, from Lyndon Baum all the way through to Sheldon Jackson, had a good faith belief that they really did own the property, because according to the IBLA, it was really kind of unclear as to what records could be, what Russian records could be achieved to straighten out whether there was original Russian land conveyance or not. So we're going to give these guys the benefit of the doubt and say they acted in good faith, which means that Sheldon Jackson was one element away from getting Redoubt Bay for itself. But that one element was fatal to them. And that was that there were no valuable improvements on the property. As we see, there were none that had been constructed on the property, and there certainly were none that were there when Sheldon Jackson submitted his application. Because Lyndon Howe did nothing. Baranoff Packing Company ran a cannery for 2 years. John Brady had a cavity built in 1891, but then abandoned it in 1910. Brady's heirs did nothing, and Sheldon Jackson did nothing. And the IBLA actually noted that there was no evidence in the record that any of these alleged owners even visited the property after about 1910. So, what did Sheldon Jackson do? They decided that, well, we didn't build any valuable improvements, and neither did any of our predecessors, but the Forest Service did. And we want to take credit for the things that the Forest Service did there. Which means essentially what we want to do is we want to take this valuable public asset out of the public domain based entirely on a public works project constructed entirely with public funds. IBLA and BLM would have none of that. It was pretty obvious what was going on. And they said, no, you can only take advantage, you could only take credit for things that you built or that were built on your behalf, and you certainly can't take advantage of improvements that were put on by the very person that you're trying to take the land away from. But the things that Sheldon Jackson pointed to were a cabin, the weir, and a trail. And let's take a look at those, because these things were not only not built by or for Sheldon Jackson or any of the predecessors, they were not valuable improvements. The cabin had been abandoned, and that's the cabin, had been abandoned since 1972. It had no windows, it had no doors, and it had very extensively rotted. The weir was a nice weir, but off-season, once the sockeye are through, that entire thing is taken apart and stored. So it's not a permanent fixture there. There is nothing there in the off-season. When I was there 2 days ago, there was nothing at that site other than a pile of sandbags which you put off to the side to help reconstruct the weir come fishing season. And then finally, there's the trail. And that, my friends, is not a valuable improvement. I walked that trail last week, and I can tell you that is just about the most unimproved trail that I have had the misadventure of walking on in 50 years of living in Southeast Alaska. So that's that. So their application was denied. And by the way, the IBLA also ruled that Sheldon Jackson had not shown exclusive adverse possession during that period. In other words, they had not shown that they had continuously and exclusively possessed that property over the requisite period of time, for two reasons. One, of course, was the lack of doing anything in the property themselves, and two was the fact that the Tlingit was always there doing what they have been doing for centuries. And so there were really two bases on which that was denied. But Lady Justice moved slowly. BLM denied Sheldon Jackson's application in 2014. The IBLA affirmed that denial in 2017. In those intervening 3 years, BLM had full authority to continue to process Sealaska's application. They didn't do a thing. Then, when the IBLA finally affirms the decision in 2017, BLM doesn't get around to actually conveying the property for 7 more years until 2024. Even though in that 7-year period, there was really, all of the hard work had already been done on that property. There was really nothing significant to be done. So you add all those up together, and eventually you get to 50 years. So you got to ask yourself, why did this whole thing take 50 years? Well, it wasn't for lack of Sealaska trying. And in 2018, then Sealaska Vice President Jaylene Arujo sent a letter to the BLM, a plaintiff letter saying, look, all the hard work has already been done. You surveyed this thing. You looked at the easements. You know what you want to do. For gosh sake, the color title action's over. Just convey the property. And they did nothing. Finally, in 2024, Joe Nelson of Sealaska elevated the matter to the Department of Interior's Solicitor General, and that may have been the tree shaking that finally got things moving, because later that year, BLM finally did convey the property. But as I mentioned, there was no real reason for, especially after IBLA's affirmance, to hold up conveyance, because the survey of the village site had been approved by BLM way back in 2011, and the easements that ended up being granted to the Forest Service, were pretty standard non-controversial easements that really shouldn't have been the cause for any delay. There's a public easement to let the public cross the property to get from saltwater to Redoubt Lake, which is a typical easement that's reserved under 17B easement of ANCSA. And then there are a couple of easements that allow the Forest Service to keep accessing the weir. Early on, for much of the time, you have to grant BLM some slack, because, as I said, they were swamped by selection applications under both ANCSA and the Statehood Act. But there's no question that the Forest Service's dogged opposition for decades, and the Sitka Conservation Society's opposition during the same period, together with Sheldon Jackson's color title application, added an additional, I don't know, 12, 13 years to the process. So, big picture, here's what the Kiksati and the Tlingit had to do to protect Redoubt Bay. First of all, they had to put up with 100 years of interloping by the Russians at Ozerkai Redoubt, by the Baranoff Packing Company, by John Brady in his cabin. Then they had to fight a grueling 50-year fight to protect the village under ANCSA. And it's that latter 50 years, I think there's a couple of reasons for the severity of the opposition, particularly from the Conservation Society. One is the perception that, oh my gosh, if Sealaska gets the land, they're going to industrialize the land. They're going to ruin it, they're going to destroy it. Even though Section 14H1, the historical site section, forbids any use that's inconsistent with the historical value of the property. And also that Sealaska would cut off access to the lake, because you do have to go kind of through that property to get to the lake. Even though there's a provision on ANCSA, it's section 17B, that authorizes public easements across ANCSA property to get to public property on the other side, which again is exactly what BLM did. Then I think that there's probably a concern that that Sealaska would cut off public's dip netting of sockeye at the falls, but that doesn't happen. But I think a lot of this is due to public misconception about the limited purpose of Section 14H1, which is to allow protection of historic sites that lie outside of general selection areas. But you couple that misperception together with a color of title action, and you get a recipe for a 50-year battle, which is kind of precisely what happened here. So that, ladies and gentlemen, wraps me up. And all these question marks are here for questions that any of you might have.
And for those of you who are tuning in online, I'll take your questions and I'll ask them for you.
First off, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. It was awesome to hear about all of this. I was super curious about who was representing Sheldon Jackson when they were dissolved. Like who, I don't know, like who was the legal arbiter of that? I thought that was a very interesting point.
Cabot Christensen.
We do have a couple comments. We have someone that just said Ganesh, thank you. And we have some people tuning in from Ketchikan.
Glad to hear it.
All right, well, that concludes John Tillinghast's lecture. We'd like to thank everyone for coming here today. Ganesh to Kutnyuhan. We're so grateful that you all came here today. Please give John Tillinghast another round of applause.
It was a pleasure. This was a fun one to do.
That's a good, it's a long battle.
Yeah, it was a long battle.
No, it should not.